Okay, we got some great compelling stories wrapped around the medical industry today. So who am I? I've been using FileMaker since version 3. I am a traditionally trained IT guy, so all the IT bad mouthing of the departments that don't get FileMaker, I'll wear a bullseye on my back, but I've been able to get FileMaker in every organization that I've worked in. Wall Street, Fortune 50 companies, not-for-profits. I started primarily keeping track in version 3 with some backup tapes on a DEC VAX or a Series 1, and it grew from there. I've always been traditionally the infrastructure using disaster recovery, high availability, and ER systems like JD Edwards and SAP, where I did link FileMaker into. I moved into healthcare in 2008 and worked for a very prominent not-for-profit organization in New York City. We had 36 ambulatory clinics doing over 365,000 patient visits a year. And I was their Epic administrator and IT director. Who am I in real life? I'm also a New York State Vice President for the Elks, and as a hobby I do sound engineering and video editing.
Hello, I'm Tim Brown, and I develop secure custom solutions for healthcare industry. I helped Robert build this first system that we're going to be case studying, and then we're going to have 2 other case studies for other different solutions.
So I'm currently the CTO at Allen Healthcare. It's a New York State Department of Health licensed home care agency. And we all know what's going on in the world today, or at least in the United States. Am I need a different mic? Any better? All right, thank you. So we know that there's a crisis brewing in the United States around healthcare. The continually rising costs, 18% of our gross domestic product today is wrapped around healthcare. The average U.S. spending is over $9,000 for an average American. Yet, if we compare ourselves to the over 200 other civilized countries around the world, theirs are 3 times less, $3,200. We're 169th out of 224 in infant mortality, and 27.9% of the total spending in the United States for healthcare today is wrapped around the last year of a person's life. So clearly we have a crisis here that we need to deal with. The outcomes are below other nations. We're going to become insolvent in as little as 12 years, and the only solution is to hopefully reduce costs because of the rising age population. So somebody in Washington woke up one day and realized with the growing aging population and the fact that on average it costs $92,000 to put someone in a nursing home per year, that's average. In a large urban city, it could be 3 times that patients would rather be at home and would cost us 3 times less per year to provide home health care. So let me give you a little bit of background of home health care. Today, and rising, there are 3.3 million patients that are on Medicaid, totaling $19 billion a year for just home health aid services. It's always been considered secondary care. It was never, ever part of the continuum of care. The industry is very low margin and high volume.
So we have some serious challenges from a home software perspective, and there were limited choices when we started looking at potential solutions to put in to manage home health aid nurses. There was nothing out there. There was stuff for skilled nursing, but not to manage the home health aid nurses that have to go out into the field. And there's a reason for that. It's mainly because Each state is a little bit different. Allen mainly does Medicaid patients, and a lot of other states do not provide home health aides to those indigent population. And then the workflow around the aids and being able to bill can all be done in separate systems. So we need to have some type of bolt-on application to manage the field nurses and manage the clinical care that is being provided, but not to manage the actual aids.
So the industry is extremely antiquated. As Tim said, every state has different regulations, which means there isn't really a breadth of software in the commercial market that's out there to support what we need to do. The industry is under increased pressure for transformation. They're moving the home health industry into the continuum of care, which means that our company and others in the industry need to be able to communicate with EMRs, the RIOs, the doctors, the continuum of care from end to end. So here's the problem. If you take a look at the demographics of the industry, starting with the nurses, they're usually nurses at the end of their career. Very brilliant nurses, but I can tell you factually they're very computer illiterate. So that was very difficult to overcome, to be able to give them a mobile device and send them off in the field. So that was a challenge that we had. All clinical work up to this point was done on paper. Labor costs were rising, and additional work was being pushed down to us from the contract, the insurance companies of the world. So today we have about 10,000 patients in New York City, Long Island, and Westchester County, just north of New York City. We have about 12,000 home health aides supporting that. Now the industry right now is in this huge flux, as I said, transition, and we're changing from a fee-for-service to value-based pricing. Now all of you are sitting out there and going, well, I don't need a home health aide right now, so it doesn't affect me. It absolutely affects everyone in America, okay? Fee-for-service, we all know it. I got a pain in my abdomen, I get thrown into an ambulance, taken to the hospital. They say, okay, I need an appendectomy. They roll me into surgery. Somebody in the billing department looks on a chart, you have Blue Cross Blue Shield. Oh, we're going to give you $2,000 to remove his appendix. Value-based pricing, you get paid for the patient outcome. So now you wheel me into the OR, you get $1,000 instead of $2,000 for the operation. And if I remain healthy up to 6 months out, and there's sliding schedules depending upon what we're talking about, you will then get the other $1,000. So if I develop sepsis in the hospital, if I have other complications associated with that, the doctor, the hospital, the continuum of care is going to be penalized for that. We saw this coming down 4 years ago. We knew we had to do something. So what can we do? We have the same compensation. We know the population is rising. We know our business is increasing. And it almost became like an I Love Lucy episode with the chocolate rolling down the conveyor belt. So the initial reaction from the management was, well, let's just bring in more cases and we'll bring in more administration people. And the conveyor belt went quicker. We were literally drowning. We could not make up the difference. I've been with the organization for 6 years. I was hired purely as an IT guy to manage the aging infrastructure. We were running Microsoft Exchange 3 or something even before 2000. The only other things that we ran in-house were 2 primary systems, which was the scheduling and billing for the aides and the accounting system. So they hired me as the first trained IT person to take a look at the department and grow with the company. I only had one other guy. The other guy really did desktop support. The other thing that was apparent from the second day I walked in was the internal resistance. And everybody faces this, right? Tons of computer illiteracy. When they hire people, they don't even ask them, are you computer illiterate? Yet every function they do, they're sitting in front of a computer. And their idea of office automation is to send an email to another person. The concerns were that they would lose control of everything they're doing. If they don't understand the concepts, if they're not comfortable using the machines. We were unsuccessful in smaller attempts, but what did those smaller attempts mean? I said, explain to me how you failed. He said, well, I took a piece of paper that had a patient's signature and I walked it over to the copier, which was plugged in to this computer thing, and it created a PDF for me in my home directory. And then I need to take that and I need to drag it to the patient's folder on the SAN. Yet when I came back the next day, not only was that document missing, but the patient's folder was missing and several other things. So again, simple things that you try to put in place were becoming disastrous. Generally, the fear of the unknown is what we're talking about. You're up.
So, after looking at what the main issues were within the organization, we decided that we had to come up with some type of solution, and we're looking towards the iPad. We have field nurses that have to go out to the field. They were carrying paper. They were putting it in their bags. So thick, about this much paper they were using a week. And then that paper would come back into the organization, then someone would key it into a system. And then from there, it might get scanned and moved into the file management system that Robert was talking about. So it wasn't even a secure process, even though it was paper, since it's being transported from one place to another. So the iPad was an ideal solution, but we also couldn't rely on connectivity, because they're going into projects, they're going into houses and apartment buildings that may not have any type of internet connection. So we had to be able to synchronize this information back and forth between the systems so they could do this offline management. And then we focused in on getting all of that paper out of the way. So they would sign all the forms, all on the iPads, and that way when it came back, there was nothing more for the case management to do from actually inputting that information into the system. They just reviewed it at that point.
So the solution, when I joined the company, wearing my Epic hat and understanding how an organization should run, was that there was no magic bullet. Literally, whatever was done for the clinical systems and the other systems that I developed had to be done outside of my normal business day. But I knew that if I can win my converts, if I can show the ROI and productivity, they would then start to spoon feed me some more stuff and buy into the equation. So I developed a multi-pronged approach in how to deal with this. It all had to hit these 4 points at the bottom. Every application that I wrote, we needed to drive out costs, we needed to increase productivity, we needed to continually measure, because if you can't measure, you can't improve. And we needed to continually enhance the products that we did. The clinical system was our crowning jewel, and still remains so. It took 4 months to develop from the time the steering committee said, and the steering committee didn't even understand the term steering committee, let alone proper project management. I remember vaguely, I said, well, we need to whiteboard this, and they didn't know what a whiteboard was. So this is the level of competency from a modern company and how we're dealing with it, to try and take them into the modern age. The ROI for the entire system, which included all the licensing, all the development costs of $100,000, all of the training, soup to nuts, 84 days. 84 days. Well, how did we achieve that? So Tim said that, okay, nurses are coming in and they're bringing in these papers. So a nurse has to come in, usually it takes a half a day, depending upon where they are geographically, to come into the office, drop off their papers, pick up a whole set of papers. An initial assessment is 34 forms. Now that pile of paper sits there and somebody needs to key it in. And previously, before the system, what they keyed into was what was built into our commercial software, which was a fillable PDF. So it was completely unstructured. In addition to that, the internal case manager, who was responsible for reviewing this, would always find issues. A piece of paper is missing, she dropped it, she left it at home, and forgot it in the bag. Or you couldn't read her handwriting. So now you had to wait for the following week. So here's a simple example of how we turned 34 days of invoicing, because you can't bill until you do the visit, into 3. We began winning new business because we became 100% compliant. And within 24 months, we increased our patient census by 26%, and we were able to do that with 15% less staff. In the first half of the year, we did 17,000 patient visits. The company's goal, now that we've been acquired by a much larger company called Alara Caring, which is the 3rd largest healthcare company in the United States, is to double our business in the next 2 years. And part of that strategy, the corporate has come in and looked at the clinical system and said, this is a system that works. And we want to take this system and potentially use it across the country. All the nursing forms are validated on the iPad. So they either get a drop-down selection of what they can do and can't do. No need for the field nurses to come into the office. And the productivity increased by like 40%. We went from 3 visits a day to 5. Now you need to understand that we get contracted through the insurance company and get paid about $1.40 an hour higher than the salary of the aide on average. We get no compensation for putting a nurse in the house. And minimally, we have to put a nurse in the house every 90 days. So all the nursing visits are free. Best of all, we were able to start to use that data, and we were able to minimize the admission costs. So you watch the commercials on TV, you know that the federal government is handing off, especially for Medicaid, handing off these programs to third-party insurance companies, right? Medicaid Advantage, Part B, blah, blah, blah. Those are the people that we're dealing with. They're getting paid a fixed fee per year per patient. Whatever money they don't spend on that patient, that's profit for them. The most expensive cost that they have is the hospitalization of their patient. So if we can reduce the hospitalization, we become the vendor of choice. And FileMaker was the right tool. Why? Low cost of entry. I mean, think about doing this in a .NET environment with servers and 17,000 visits and trying to code something, right? Fast development. 3 months to do the whole development for the cutover. Significantly less cost than an EMR. So the only application that we saw, third-party commercial-based, would have cost us $850,000 to purchase, plus 15% maintenance per year, plus the hosting cost of the software, based upon the data that was put through the system, and it wasn't designed for the home care industry. So we needed to customize it at a rate of $300 an hour for some developers that maybe they can get to in 3 to 6 months. So the solution was clear. We needed a custom app. We also started to discover, which was never part of the equation, that the system produced far more beneficial results than we ever imagined. So, no lost paper. Every insurance company comes in and does an audit once a year. And minimally, they come in and they ask for 5 patients' files. And if one piece of paper that's required is missing from that folder, they can recoup up to 110% of all the money they gave us for the prior year. Yeah, everybody's going, what? 110%. So if a patient hasn't signed a consent form, you're not able to deliver services. And how do you know? Well, the patient signed it. Well, you don't have it here. So if the patient never consented to the service, then therefore you should not have provided the service, then therefore we don't have to pay you for the service. One piece of paper. We're capturing it on the iPad. The audits, 100% on starting the second year, passing. Why? Because they walk in, they ask for the 5 files, we go and we check the 5 patients, they sit in a room on a computer, they can look at all of the documents associated with that patient and that patient only, they run through it, they're happy, they're in and out. The quickest thing you want to do, it's like the IRS, right? You want to get them in, you want to get them out. The industry is in a state of flux. We talked about that. DOH requirements are like constitutional law. You ask 4 people what this regulation means, you'll get 5 answers. Right? So there's always this state that's going on as to what's the right thing or wrong thing to do. And the system's very flexible. So with the Antidote, we built a form-based solution to be able to quickly add questions to different forms, associate the forms to the contract. So if a contract wants a specific question to be answered, we can do that. Oh, and by the way, the New York City Human Resources Administration that has a contract with us, they will only take their forms with their information on it, on paper. Remember I said we're antiquated? So Antidote built an overlay, and we took all the data elements that are in the system, more than are required, used the overlay. Instead of printing it out on ours, we put it on the overlay for HRA, and off it went. And now we solved the problem. GPS tracking. You know, every time you turn up over a rock, you find another problem. So here's something we never imagined. The first year, we lost 40% of our nurses. They left. Now, we expected a couple of them to go. They weren't computer literate. They were getting ready to retire, right? But it's funny when you look at an iPad, data that comes down, and the nurse says, I was at the patient's home and the patient didn't answer the bell. I said, well, that's pretty cool because it shows here you were at the beach. So what we're finding is that the nurses that we are hiring, they understand the rules now, the game, how the game's played. We're getting much more productivity out of them. From my perspective, the methodology in being able to push this through the organization was to take my experience, hardware, software development, project management, Epic, and use that. We use strict project management principles. Although we did agile development, nothing was rolled in until our informatics person in the clinical department said, this is okay to go. Yes, there were times that they said, this is okay to go, and we rolled it out, and oh my gosh, it's wrong. That's going to happen. But at least our hands were wiped clean. We did what we needed to do. We're not the clinicians. I started developing small apps, as I told you. That's how I got to the bigger impact. As I shared with you earlier, I focused on the ROI, because that's all the back office wants to know about is the ROI. And I aligned with the converts, so the small development programs that I did internally for each department, when I won them over, they became allies of mine. All the data that we collected started to become the basis for our data warehouse. Everything, all internal development is in FileMaker for Allen Healthcare, a $300 million a year company, which is now part of a $1.3 billion a year company. So I developed a call center app. So 40,000 calls come into our call center a day, in or out. So we're logging all of those. An incident and complaint system. Legally, we need to be able to capture, monitor, and report back a resolution to the contract and the Department of Health if a patient makes a complaint. 2,500 of them on average a year. I developed a 5-stage process whereby it goes through, and at the end, with remediation, we can bring the aide back in. They may need some additional training. We may need to terminate them based upon what was done. We also, because we have that information, are starting to see patterns developing. So just like the nurses and the iPads, with the GPS tracking, we have a patient with dementia calling saying, hey, I'm missing my wedding ring. And before, you know, well, the patient has dementia. But now if you bring up that ticket and you look under the AIDS portal, there was an allegation 6 months ago. There was an allegation 3 months ago. Now it's a pattern's developing. So we're harnessing that data for many different purposes. I also developed an early clinical system, early warning detection system in WebDirect that we pushed out to the aides' smartphones. So now they can alert us if the patient didn't go to the bathroom, had a urinary tract infection, something simple, right? Had a fever. Let's deal with it now. The medically underserved, especially the elderly population, many with dementia, aren't going to deal with it. So the fever turns into something worse, and then pneumonia, and then they get admitted into a hospital with a $100,000 bill to the insurance company. Meanwhile, we could have addressed it the week before, contacted the doctor and dealt with it. So here's a typical scenario of how we ran our business. On the top left-hand side, the contract would call us. Somebody in intake would enter that system, enter that information into a SaaS-based third-party system in a browser. And then some emails would go out and follow up to the clinical department to say, hey, we got a patient that we need to start servicing. So we need you to get a nurse out on Monday. Okay, so the clinician brings out the stack of paper. Paper comes back. They're keying it back into these fillable PDFs. We're storing the paper. Oh, by the way, we're spending a couple of $100,000 on storage because we got maybe 3 rooms this size full of paper to the ceiling. And when you get hit with a subpoena, you try and find a piece of paper. This is what it looks like today. It's a completely integrated solution. So when the information's entered in to the SaaS environment, third party, it immediately flows down. We started with email, and working with them, we do FTP today. So we know change in patient status. Is the patient admitted or discharged? It's kind of embarrassing when you send a nurse out to do a visit and the patient passed away 2 days ago. Happened. We're now moving to another system, that other SaaS system there, where we're going to have real-time integration via their Microsoft SQL Server. With script triggers, they're going to push that stuff down to us in real time. Information's done on the iPad, pushed to the office with a sync, validated, and completed. So what we're working on now is a full scale, whereby on the bottom left-hand corner, all these other third-party systems that we have are being fed base information, such as a patient census. We're doing APIs, so we've done some really cool stuff. In New York City, 4 years ago, we had Hurricane Sandy in New York's, in the East Coast. Okay, so Sandy comes through. 2 years later, the Department of Health wakes up and goes, oh, we need to start keeping track of the flood zones for every patient. So every time that you add a patient or change their address, you need to go to this huge wall map, try and figure out where the heck the patient lives, and where the flood zone is so that you could type it in. So now we got a script trigger on the address that sends an API message out to New York City Office of Emergency Management, and it comes back with the flood zone. We're also working on connecting to our RIOs, our regional health organizations. 7 data centers throughout New York State, all interconnected. All the EMRs from all the hospitals are all connected to them. I could speak to the New York City, Long Island area. I don't know in the rural areas if they're all connected, but at least down in the metropolitan area it is. And when a patient gets admitted to a hospital, we're going to get a message automatically telling us patient was admitted. Dozens of times a day out of the 10,000 patients, we'll send an aide out. The aide will show up at the door and ring the bell, and somebody will say, oh, she got taken to a hospital last night by ambulance. We got to pay that aide for the day. How about the patients being discharged, and we aren't providing the aid because no one told us that they were being discharged? So we're going to continue to build out this clinical system with third-party services. We're going to be researching and expanding into different states. We're going to be expanding the data elements so that we can capture and do analytics or informatics against it. Do you realize that Quest Labs makes more money today selling the results of your urine analysis than they make by performing the test and charging your insurance company? They've moved in a completely different business model. And if you're interested in learning more, come up and see me at the end. There's a great book on value-based pricing if you're in the healthcare area. We're looking at logistics. So now we're going to start with the next version, looking at where the patients are and how we should, although the nurses have a particular territory, that territory can be 20 miles, we'll schedule those visits in blocks so that we can get more productivity out of them. We're going to be migrating to AWS. Why? Primarily right now because the new system that we're going to, the SaaS system, is in AWS. So it just makes a lot of sense. But we'll be looking and following the story that we heard from the keynote about where they're going with the new services at FileMaker. And then consolidating with other lines of business. So not only does the parent company own home health solutions, they have skilled nursing solutions as well. They have urgent cares. They have physical therapies. So now we can share that information across the continuum. So if it makes sense when the patient's discharged, they may start off with skilled nursing, they may go to home health aid, we may have to send them to PT, or we may have to then take them and bring them to an urgent care rather than an emergency room for something simple like a fever, which is going to significantly reduce that cost, save the insurance company money, become the vendor of choice.
So we're going to move ahead a little bit because, Robert, isn't that really compelling? I mean, all the things that he's been able to do in 4 years of being there. And it's been great for us at Antidote to be a part of the ride of that and knowing and working on a solution that really has not transformed a business, but also impacts upon the healthcare of the patients that they serve. So we have 2 other case stories that I'll briefly go through that we were also working on, and I'll just quickly pass through some of these screens that we have of the system. So the first one is Northwell Health Systems for cardiology. So Northwell Health System is one of the largest health systems in the country, located on Long Island, and they had a very unique problem. And we were dealing it within cardiology. So the EP and cath labs had a workflow issue, let's say. And not to the fault of the people that were working on it, but it was a manual process. And the charge nurses who are responsible for the management of that workflow of sending patients from the pre-op to the procedure rooms to recovery and then discharged were being circumvented by the doctors. Because it was all being managed in a whiteboard, which is very, very common, don't get me wrong. But what's the problem with a whiteboard? The doctors see it, they erase and put their name in there, and they moved the patient into that procedure room. So the communication was off. Now the charge nurse does not know what just happened with that procedure room, because they're not constantly around. I've walked with them, you'll see a picture of it in a second. You know, they have other things they have to do too. They're generally almost always around, but someone needs to be managing the process. And because of that, they're having idle rooms. These are really expensive rooms to sit there with no one in there. They're seeing about 50 to 60 cath lab patients a day, and they probably do about a dozen to 15, maybe at the top end 20 EP procedures a day. The scheduling side of it was time consuming too. It was backwards to me. I worked in hospitals. I worked for the Hospital for Special Surgery for 10 years. And I did a lot of analysis. I worked in finance. And I did a lot of analysis about workflow and making things more efficient. What was happening here was the departments are kind of running separately, and they could do their own thing. So they had to input. When they put a patient in for a schedule, they had to put them into SIS, which is their scheduling software for surgery, which gave them no information back because they weren't being managed in that system. They then would have to put it into Excel because they had an Excel TV screen of all the patients for that day. And then they had a Google Doc too, that they were sharing with people to let them know what patients were being seen, because they needed more than one person to access the Excel spreadsheet. And then lastly, they need to identify to the doctors that the patient was booked, so they would get an Outlook invite. So then they put it in on a shared calendar, they would get an invite and saying, you have a whatever procedure at 9 a.m. in procedure room 3. So the solution was to really centralize it, because it really wasn't before. So this is me with the first day that we went live with one of the charge nurses. She has an iPad in her hand, and we had 2 boards to replace the whiteboards. The one board was for the cath lab, and the other one was for the EP lab. And it was very much an iterative process, and I'll get to that in a minute. But now the charge nurses were able to manage these boards from their iPads rather. No one could change it. The doctors, you can imagine some of the tension back from the doctors that they can't now erase their name or put a magnet on the board, tell a tech to go get this patient that he was ready. But we try to do some other things for them to make it more usable, more palatable. So we check them into the rooms, in the procedure rooms, right from the thing. And we also then put on there too who the next patient was that was going to hit that room as well. So it became a real part of communication, not with just the physicians, but the techs that were running those rooms and the nurses as well. On the booking side, we made a very simple change. So they actually, you can't really see behind there, they actually schedule by procedures now. So if it was the EP side or the cath side, they would get a different screen, and they would click the time slot they want to put the patient into, and then automatically, once they select a procedure, we had times, how long it would take for each procedure, and therefore you would start getting this blocking system, as we're very familiar with calendaring systems. Because also there, the schedulers would say, it's not really 2 hours, it's an hour. So they're making their own decisions on how long it's something going to take. Eventually, we're going to have enough metrics in the system that we'll know how long it's going to take for that specific doctor, because it definitely varies, and it can vary by a lot. In some cases, I think quicker is sometimes better with some doctors. We also, in the scheduling system, made it so that the invites go out to the doctors automatically. So we're doing we have a shared calendar, we're using a plugin, and then those invites go out to the doctor. So they're really happy about that. So they kept something, because I didn't want them to manually do this. You know, it was just a waste of time. And so we removed all those redundant tasks. So this is what the charge nurse screen looks like. So we have a bunch of patients that are coming to arrival. I'll say this so no one's going to ask me, is this real patient data? No, it's not. It's de-identified. I even created a script to do that for all my healthcare applications. It goes through and removes all the patients if I need to have some data. But they can arrive the patient by clicking on the red button. Once they arrive, they turn pink. They turn green when they're ready because they have the consents, they check the PSTs, and they're ready to go for the procedure room. And they're managing through discharge. The discharge is really the discharge off their service. It could be discharged to home, but it could be discharged to an inpatient floor, or even to I'm just losing it, to an ICU unit as well. We also had to accommodate add-on patients, especially for the cath side of the business. EP, they're all scheduled for the most part. The cath side is constantly add-ons for that day. They could have a dozen add-ons in a given day for that. So that was a laborious process. You should have seen the pieces of paper the nurses were carrying around before with managing all these patients. The one thing I didn't realize was we had to come up with an offline process too. I don't have a slide for this, but I think it's worth mentioning, which is that they would, if the system went down, what happens? They're relying on paper. They have no monitors. They don't know where anyone is. Every 5 minutes, a PDF is generated of all the patients that are sitting on one of the computers right there. So if the system goes down, they can actually print out, and they'll be maybe 5 minutes behind. So the lab view is a little bit different. So this is the board that's outside all the procedure rooms, and you can see that it says lab, and those are the lab that are in there, and then we can put in who the next patient is too. On the middle column, where it says scheduled, those are all the patients that are left to get through. And the color status means that obviously the pink means that they arrived, but the green ones are the ones that are ready, and all the white ones or gray ones below are not ready. They haven't even arrived yet. So the doctors then have an idea, and the nursing staff has an idea of how many people are left for the day on the cath side. And then we have all our completed visits on the right-hand side. They know exactly where the patients are at any given point. And in fact, so much so, we actually put a monitor into the waiting room for the volunteers to be able to provide them with information. So on the EP side, it's a little different on the board. They don't have as much moving around. So we actually give them the whole schedule for the day, what each procedure room is going to be. The cath side was so much more, they're moving people in and out. This one we need to put in before this one. This doctor's not ready, they hasn't even come here yet. And because of that too, we added into the system, when that room is ready, we can send a message to the doctor to their iPhone. It doesn't matter what phone it is, it's just an MMS message, okay? And they like that. So full view, still communicating with the team, and this is a bigger view of that same screen for them, so you can kind of see. It gives them a little information. If anesthesia is going to be there, there'll be a little needle. If there are issues with the patient, that they have a certain communicable disease or stuff that they need to be aware, you'll see different icons for different things. So the keys to the success for this was making an iterative process. We went live, and I found more things that we needed to do once we went live than I did in the first 6 months of talking with people there. Why doesn't it do this? Well, when did you tell? Well, no, we didn't, but I thought you would, I knew what? I mean, it was insane. Even a lot of the stuff that I showed you was not part of it. Like the Outlook calendar. I had no idea they were sending out a calendar, invites or anything like that. We had to add that in afterwards. And so make it an iterative process, and that's where FileMaker is really successful at. We tailored to this specific specialty. Because I'm sure there's other systems out there that might be able to do that, but it's not specific to the EP and Cath lab issues. And that's why I think they decided to work with us. We also needed to design with privacy in mind, privacy/security. We wanted to make sure that the information that was in the system was only accessible to the right people. Like we had the volunteers. They don't get to see what procedure it was. They only get to see the patient's first name to begin with, and then if they say they want to see the last name, they can click on it. And that way, if someone's looking over the shoulder, they don't know who anyone is. I read something a few weeks ago, and I wholly believe this, that providers, specifically physicians, don't put up with stuff that doesn't save them any time. And that's why you see, I think, the EMRs out there that they just don't really take to. It doesn't save them time. All the doctors that I've talked to hate every EMR system that they've touched because they're not having the face time. And we do flexibility. So this next case study is called Androbia Life Sciences. And this is a small andrology lab in New Jersey. And it was a great experience in working with them. And they were a startup company. And they patented a very specific fertility test for men. But they needed a LIMS system. So a laboratory information management system. They didn't have one. It's going to be really, really costly to go out to the internet to buy one or get a SaaS one. And so they wanted something simple, and it would be overkill. They have one test, that's all they're performing. And so they hired us to develop a system. And since there was no out-of-box, and they had this patent, they needed an easy way to quick score these tests. So they're under microscope, taking picture, and then they have to count the sperm and whether or not grade all of them. So we had to come up with a way of helping do that. And they wanted to do it all on iPads in the labs. They didn't want a computer next to the microscope because it was going to take up too much space. They also wanted to share the reports with the fertility clinics. Well, we got to do that securely. You know, we could mail them, I guess, but it wouldn't be timely. We can't email the PDFs. I guess we could set up some type of secure FTP. So we use WebDirect for that. We'll get more into detail on that. And then they wanted to actually share information with patients as well. So the solution was we built a LIMS system based on an iPad. There was also ability to have it on a laptop, obviously, but we designed it specifically for the iPad, and then we could see it on a PC or a Mac. It didn't matter at that point. So these same screens that we're looking at would work perfectly on an iPad. We created that WebDirect portal for physicians once the test was ready, the report was ready. And they were able to then go online and thank God for 16 and be able to do PDFs on the server side for that. That saved us a lot of pain. And then on the patient portal, we used custom web publishing using PHP because we wanted that to be more robust in certain ways. The web portal was really simplistic to do, but they wanted to do credit card processing and stuff like that on there. But it kept on changing because it's a startup and their investors are like, oh, let's go over to the European market. And we'll have those labs take pictures of them, come up, we'll grade them. And so we had to set up all this different stuff. It was insane. So grading the sperms was very simple. We had to put them into buckets. But the iPad's not tactile, right? We can't really know if we're hitting it. They're under a microscope. They can't see where they are on the iPad. So they would prepare the slides, and then we used a numeric keypad with Bluetooth, and they could actually tactile. So what they actually do is they actually have different colors on each of those numeric ones. And so that way, as anyone's done key punching like me before, since I was in finance, and it started out in AP, that number 5 button is your friend with a little raised up dot, right? And so that way, underneath the microscope, they can quickly do it. And right when that's done, a report is generated. It then just needs to be approved by the lab administrator. And I'll just mention that before making the physician portal ready. We also use snapshot links. Everyone know snapshot links? So the lab director is not always on site. So we have maybe a manager who can approve stuff that's within range, but the lab director has to approve anything that has a negative outcome, right? And so we would send him an email to say that you need to go on, and here's a snapshot link of a patient that was not in range. Click on the link, FileMaker Go opens up on his iPhone. He then can actually sign off and approve it right from his iPhone, no matter where he is. And that was such a simplistic way of handling that HIPAA issue by sending data that may not be secure, right? So we don't have to provide any patient information. And in fact, when he clicks on that, it'll also give him a queue of everyone else that might be there that he needs to approve right then. Once he approves it, it's ready for the physician portal. Nothing else has to happen at that point. So an email will go out automatically on a server-side script to the referring physician to let them know that the report is ready. It doesn't provide any PHI information, just says the report is ready from the lab. So then they click on the link that's embedded in there. They sign in, they have their own account, and then they can see all of their patients that have reports. And they can see anyone that's even associated with their group. So maybe a physician is out that week, but someone else needs to review the report inside of their site or group. Then when they're in the portal, they're able to download the report. So the report looks basically like that. And then we send an email reminder to the physician too, every 3 days in case they haven't reviewed it yet. Just in case. We don't want it to fall through the cracks. They certainly don't want to fall through the cracks. Remember, they're a startup company too, so they want them to use this service. And it's the only male fertility test that's out there. So once again, the keys to success for this was an iterative process. Okay, it was changing as we're going based on needs, based on someone had a great idea over here, and so we need to be flexible about that. We certainly tailored the process of their specific lab. I don't think, we could never take this and say, this will work for this lab. We would have to make some significant changes. And we're certainly saving the provider's time with this whole thing. The user interface was really important. Inside and outside. On the patient side, the web, we spent days going over that and making changes. And I gotta say, my client loved me working in WebDirect because I could make changes. So right there in front of him, he could see them. And he was like, they were astounded, like you could do this. When it came to the patient side with the PHP, it had to go back to the office. Like, why is this taking so much longer? Like, can you move this over a couple pixels? It was like, no, it doesn't work that way. I mean, and that was a great thing for that, but the other side, when they saw the contrast and why that patient portal cost so much more than the physician portal, they kind of knew why at that point with all the extra coding that you had to do. We're basically done, so Robert's going to come back up here, and if you have questions, please step up to the microphone, and we'll be happy to take any of your calls. God, it's getting to be long. I can say that on Thursday. This is the second time I spoke today. But please ask any questions you might have. And I agree with Robert on ROI. It's important to have your ROI and know how things, to know your metrics. Yes?
You mentioned you mentioned something about a plugin, and I wondered, did you use it for the calendaring? And if so, what was it?
I used Productive Computings. Okay. All I needed to use was the Outlook one and not the full Exchange one for what I'm doing. I've used both in different scenarios. The Exchange one I actually used at the Hospital for Special Surgery, as opposed to this one that we're doing at Outlook for them. Any other questions?
Yeah, hi, Tim.
Yeah.
Well, actually, a question first for Robert. So just in general about the value-based pricing that's heading forward. So are you referring to, is CMS dictating that, or are you talking about private insurance companies?
Right now it's CMS, but clearly, I mean, it's going to be pervasive through the industry, especially if they could see real results from the CMS.
Yeah, yeah. And Tim, just wondering if you follow a value-based pricing model.
Well, from when we're doing pricing for clients and project-based pricing as opposed to the value-based stuff for insurance.
Yeah, not talking about the healthcare pricing, but in terms of consulting in your practice. You know, not to dig into too many details of your business, but I'm just curious, since it came up in Robert's presentation, it's something that I'm curious about. I'm wondering if you tackle that at all.
We do, with different success. You know, I think it's something that it's a learned thing. You know, so we do hourly billing. We like to move more towards value-based billing. And from a project management standpoint and getting clients buy-in and understanding what's absolutely going to be included in that and where those breaking points are. Because it does put the risk on the developer as opposed to keeping the risk on the client. Yeah. And maybe there should be more of a shared risk in some of the stuff.
Healthcare companies are so price sensitive because their margins can be so small that like you, I've had varying success. You know, they're happy to push the risk back on me, but you know, at the same time, there has to be a balance there. Thank you.
I was just wondering if you could briefly talk about any extra regulatory requirements you had to overcome because you were building it. You mentioned protected health information, but there's also oftentimes requirements imposed by government, FDA, digital signature requirements, validation, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Either of these systems.
Yeah, we did a HIPAA. I did a HIPAA talk yesterday, and we kind of briefly talked about that. So when the regulations on HIPAA are very vague when it comes to what you need to do. So you have to look at other regulatory stuff like the CFR 21 Part 11, so electronic signatures, and how they deem it to be, you know, acceptable. And you can replicate a lot of that stuff in FileMaker very, very easily.
Did you have to document that externally at all, or did you just make sure that your systems followed those rules? In certain industries, there's a requirement for very extensive validation documentation that has to be available for external audits. Mm-hmm. Did you have to face that at all, or is that
not really? Not for what we do. I know on the FDA side, it's much more rigorous than this. So I think for the vast majority of the stuff, HIPAA, they don't care until there's a breach, right? There's no certification process, you know, for it for non-EMR type of systems. So, and even hospitals don't even give you a policy of what their policies are. You kind of have to figure it out as you go along. Yeah. Okay? Thank you so much. If you have any questions, certainly come up and talk to us. They're cutting us off.